Stop the world!
Welcome to Stop the World. I'm David Rowe.
And I'm Olivia Nelson.
Today's guest has fast become something of a superstar in artificial intelligence policy circles. He's none other than Dean Ball, who'll be very familiar to anyone who follows AI closely. We've been trying to get Dean on the podcast for a while, so he very kindly squeezed us in before starting a new role at OpenAI. Propitious timing, Liv.
Yes, Dean must be the most anticipated guest on Stop the World, Dave.
Yep.
Dean was the principal author of the Trump administration's AI Action Plan, which was a kind of founding document for the administration's direction on AI policy. He's also the author of the very popular Substack Hyperdimensional, and most recently he's been a senior fellow at the Foundation for American Innovation, among other roles. But he's seemingly everywhere, with views on everything, and that's made him a very influential thinker on AI safety, governance, and the future of power.
Yeah, so there was a lot I wanted to cover with him. We got to maybe half of it. I was happy with that. He gives his views on a couple of issues that his new boss, Sam Altman, had raised in the hours before we recorded. One was the idea of a global governance body for AI standards, which Altman outlined in an op-ed to the Financial Times. Separately, the FT broke a story that Altman has been in talks with the Trump administration about giving the US government a 5% stake in OpenAI. And Dean offers some very interesting views on that.
Dean also talks about his broad outlook on AI and power, the realities of restricting access to frontier AI, and the idea that the level of AI capability in the hands of government shouldn't get too far out of proportion to the capability available to everyone else. He also talks about the role of safeguards on frontier models like Fable 5 and Mythos 5, which Anthropic has recently made public after a brief hiccup with US government. And he explains his idea for independent third-party auditors that could sit between governments and AI companies, serving as a check on both risks and excessive concentrations of power.
He then talks about the role of middle powers and the opportunities for countries like Australia in data centre construction and rare earths. He covers the realities of geopolitics and the incentives for a country like the US to hold back its most powerful capabilities, even from trusted allies like Australia. We also discussed the evolution of institutions, including governments, which Dean is writing a book about, and we finish with his thoughts on what the future looks like. He's pretty optimistic that we can make this work, even if it means some disruption and upheaval in the short term.
It'll be very interesting to see how his thinking evolves in his new role at OpenAI. Definitely a space to watch, and it was great to grab him just before he starts. So folks, enjoy Dean Ball.
Dean Ball, welcome to Stop the World.
Thank you so much for having me.
So first of all, congrats on the new appointment to the role at OpenAI. I think you start in about 3 days on Monday, your time, so we're thrilled and very grateful that you've made time for us during what's obviously a crunch time in your life, so much appreciated.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me, and it's an exciting time.
So I want to start with a simple question, which is why artificial intelligence for you? You had a liberal arts education, you started out in sort of broad public policy. I know you've written about your time at the Hoover Institution, which is in the middle of Stanford University, which of course is in the middle of Silicon Valley, so you were exposed to a lot of the conversations, I imagine. I won't get you to rehash the biographical details there, but just explain why AI has kept its hooks in you intellectually, why you've devoted your professional thinking time to it, and how would you describe your mission to date in trying to shape AI policy?
Yeah, so I mean, I've always been a pretty technical person. I sort of first learned to code when I was pretty young. I was probably like 11 or 12. And, because of that, have always paid attention to emerging technology. I've always been kind of a fan of gadgets and whatnot. So I've had basically every generation of iPhone. I bought the first iPhone in 2007. I had smartphones before that, et cetera. I've always been nerdy. I combined that with an appreciation for history once I got a little bit older. And in particular in college, I fell in love with the history of ideas. And one of the things that was just infinitely interesting to me and remains infinitely interesting to me, really, is the relationship between ideas and institutions and culture and technology, and the ways in which those things sort of inform one another and sort of debating like which one is upstream of the other and things like this always were interesting to me. And so, I kind of I'm very interested in particular in general purpose technologies, and AI is the most general of the general purpose technologies. I always kind of knew that if I felt like, artificial general intelligence, the human level AI, if that thing seemed like it was really around the corner, that would be a pivotal moment and the kind of thing that I would consider changing careers for. And then it seemed like it was happening, and like I just couldn't get the subject off of my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about it when I was doing other things. I was working in state and local economic policy at the time, but I couldn't stop thinking about AI. And so that's kind of how it happened. I realized I sort of had to do it.
I can't believe you didn't stick with state and local economic policy, really. I didn't want to make this a sort of news-driven conversation, but your soon-to-be boss, Sam Altman, has kept the Financial Times busy in the last 24 hours with a couple of pretty significant stories. So I might as well just touch on those, because one of them in particular is not a bad entree into some of the issues that I want to discuss. But look, he's written an op-ed in the FT calling for a US-led international forum, which he would describe as establishing accepted standards, provides experts and impartial analysis of capabilities and risks, and makes the technology available to nations and companies that participate and follow the rules. He says the forum could include government representatives, independent technical experts, and others. It could also serve as a governance mechanism over the labs and guard against the commercial pressures that can lead to unsafe racing. The idea that I find challenging about this is that the overwhelming decision point on safety, it seems to me, is the one that's happening at the moment at the proverbial door of the AI labs. They're asking themselves, is this new model safe to let out, basically? So Anthropic made its own decision about Mythos Preview. The US government is standing at the door, a little bit like a nightclub bouncer who makes arbitrary decisions about whether you're wearing acceptable shoes. It's a bit unclear as to what the standards are. And I know you've talked and written quite a bit about that, about the sort of the sense of arbitrary and haphazard decision-making now. Is it your understanding that we're now talking about handing that standard setting over to the whole world? And how's that going to fly with the US and with the US government and the US people?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it all sort of depends on like what does US led mean and what does international mean. I'm in some ways a very bad person to ask this question, because like literally my job for my entire career mostly was reading things that like, I worked at think tanks my whole career, but I wasn't mostly a writer myself. I was sort of working with our scholars to ideate policy ideas. And so like being critical of public policy ideas and identifying all of the mealy mouthed words that people use is like literally my profession. And so like, I just don't know what any of those words mean, right? Like, what does US led international mean?
Yep.
Like, really, exactly. Like, what does that mean exactly? That sounds good to both the US and international, right? But like, which one is it?
Yep.
I think like, I don't know. It sounds like what the op-ed is saying is like, we should have a body that makes the American government feel in charge while also making people from other countries feel good too. And it's like, I agree with that. I agree that would be a good thing to do. The question is how you do it. And I don't think, I believe that Sam has a very earnest desire to do that. And I agree that that's exactly the thing we need. But the question is, how specifically do you structure it? So I don't think that the op-ed is wrong at all on substance. But I also think that, there's a lot of work to be done in fleshing out the specifics. And by the way, I don't believe that Sam would dispute that claim.
Right. Okay. And look, I must say, as an Australian or as a non-American, it's very appealing to me, obviously, because while these are US companies and a lot of the consequential decisions are being made at the US labs or at the intersection between the US labs and the US government. However, these are models that are going to be used around the world. They are, the most powerful technology humanity has created to date, in my view, and so it affects all of us. And so obviously I would love other countries, especially sort of good international citizens like Australia, to be involved in that decision making. It's just, I suppose it's a little bit unclear to me as to how it's going to work. So look, yeah, I take your point. Let's see how that crystallizes, how it gets defined, and what kind of shape it takes, and hopefully that will become clear and it could be constructive.
Yeah.
Look, I want to spend a bit of time talking about AI and power. I want to put a position to you and get you to react to it. Obviously, as AI becomes more capable, it confers greater power on the people who are able to deploy it. My honest instinct is that I would prefer responsibility for managing such deployment. And I'm talking here about the frontier capabilities, not the more modest stuff that we don't need to worry about. And there will be plenty of that. But I'm talking about frontier capabilities. I would prefer that the responsibility sits primarily under a democratically elected and accountable government than under private companies or some other entities that are less accountable, in my view, to the many people whose lives they are going to affect. Or, as we've just discussed, perhaps it could be done by an international governance body. But, I mean, just as a starting point principle, what's wrong with that position? What am I missing?
I guess I would say, like, in broad strokes, it doesn't feel like totally wide of the mark, right? I think the AI transformation implicates the public interest in so many ways. It affects it in terms of the AI infrastructure build out. It is an infrastructure, build out that will employ millions of people, that will involve a lot of land use, that will involve, implicate the capital markets. It will just be, hugely implicative of the public order. The catastrophic risk potential of the models is also incredibly, high, right? And so, there's going to be a national security dimension to that. And then, of course, there's the economic component, which is like, how does AI change the labor market? How does it potentially upset the assumptions of our current social contract? And these are all questions that we answer in different ways and that we'll answer on different timelines. But the reason that I got into, if this were an easy case of just deregulate everything and be a total libertarian about it, I probably wouldn't have gotten into this field because that's not that interesting to me. If that were the case, I would be happy if that were the case. That would be very simple. And I would trust that the sort of libertarian contingent of the right would do a very good job articulating that view. Unfortunately, I think the reality is more complicated. So the actual really hard part of all this is going to be figuring out, like, how does the social contract change, how do we alter it? And so I think that's the art. And that's the part that I think, nobody, including me, to be very clear, has like really figured out just yet.
And it's pretty clear from what you've written and said in the past that you believe that institutions are going to have to evolve and probably evolve pretty substantially. I completely agree with that. I mean, basically, whenever I wargame or project forward how I think some possible AI future might unfold, I pretty quickly find a lot of my political and policy assumptions collapsing. It's just hard to figure out how a lot of current or legacy thinking around institutions actually can survive and persist effectively in an AI future. Working backwards from that for a moment, I suppose, you've certainly expressed a fair bit of skepticism about too much of a concentrated role for the government. I'll quote something here that you wrote on your Hyperdimensional Substack recently. Quote, "Bad AI futures are much likelier if only an extremely narrow subset of actors have access to frontier AI. This is because that narrow subset of actors is likely to be composed of groups that already have significant economic and political power, including the federal government itself. You should not expect the most powerful people in the world using the most powerful technology ever conceived in a way that is inscrutable to the public to turn out well." You're describing a balance of power dynamic there in which the government access can't get too far out of proportion, I suppose, to everyone else's. I'm trying to picture an AI future like that, but it's hard to conjure historical analogies. So perhaps we might think of a society in which the government keeps everyone else illiterate, for instance, or where it denies everybody else electricity. That could describe North Korea today, for all I know. But I mean, you were talking about general technologies before and your fascination with them. But help me understand what you are forecasting there with your concern about that out of balance power dynamic between sort of, someone with concentrated power like the federal government and all of the rest of us?
It's a great question. So I mean, like, what would be the characteristics of the world in which access to the frontier is heavily restricted? I think the one thing we need to be honest about here is that there is no version of the future where access to the frontier, in the near term at least, is going to be like totally unrestricted. I just don't think that's realistic as an outcome. And so the question is not so much, will there be limitations on the ability of the public, broadly speaking, to access the frontier? Those limitations might be economic in nature. They might be regulatory in nature. They also might be the labs themselves deciding simply not to release the models to the public. All of that is possible. And so I think the question is really not so much one of, will the frontier be restricted? It is, what will the gap be between the public frontier and the private frontier? And my hope is that that gap is kept as small as we can reasonably keep it. And I don't know exactly how to quantify that. I don't know exactly what that means, but I want the public to have a good sense of like where things are in broad terms, of what the capabilities are. Why? Well, number one, because I think this does profoundly implicate the public interest. And in a free society, the public needs to play a role in that discussion, in the discussion about like what this means, right? What is the creation of smarter than human machines, at least smarter in some ways than human machines, mean? What does the public think about that? Does the public agree that the machines are smarter than humans? These are the kinds of things that I think are quite important. Number two, there is a balance of power aspect to this, where you can imagine very scary worlds where access to the frontier is extremely restricted, and only the chosen companies, and maybe it's only the companies that the government chooses, are allowed to have access to the best models. So then, for example, imagine a world in which the government says, you have to donate X amount of money to my political campaign. And if you don't, then you're not going to get access to the best cybersecurity model. That's not implausible, right? If the government is the one deciding, and right now, like, that is literally the status quo in the United States. And I'm not saying the Trump administration is doing that. I'm not accusing them of wanting to do that. I don't know that that thought has ever crossed their minds. But what I'm saying is that the opportunity is there. And if the opportunity is there for political actors to do it, you should bet that eventually they'll exploit it, especially because, as far as I can tell, that's not explicitly illegal. And so there's all sorts of like scary things that can happen there. I think also, obviously, I'm about to join a frontier lab. I'm about to be an employee of OpenAI. So I want OpenAI to do well as a business. I want them to do great as a business. At the same time, I think we should probably be realistic that like there are balance of power issues that can happen at the frontier lab level too. And the world where one or two frontier labs dominates the world and can kingmake the companies that get all the access to the best AI, I think that is also a bad world. And then finally, the last point I would just make is that, from the perspective of civil liberties, the government monopolizing the technology is a world in which, like, I think our civil liberties are most imperiled, because it would just be impossible for like the rest of society to keep up. And I think that in order to prevent government from monopolizing the technology, from the perspective of politics, you need there to be a lot of actors in the economy who really depend upon that technology. So if the government tried to take away smartphones, a lot of people in America claim that they don't like their smartphones. But I'm like quite sure that if the government tried to ban smartphones, there'd be a mass revolt by American businesses and the American public, And so that is the sort of thing we want to get AI to the point where like lots of businesses are dependent upon it. Lots of people rely on it for their daily lives, because that's the way in which we have a political balance of power around the technology.
I often joke how wonderful it would be if I accidentally, dropped my iPhone in the toilet, for instance, and didn't have a functioning iPhone for 48 hours. I mean, it's a joke that it lasts all of a nanosecond, because in reality, I would be anxious beyond belief if I didn't have that connectivity. I mean, I might as well bring up the other thing that Mr. Altman has, well, he hasn't contributed it. It was a story that the FT broke. But since you mentioned that idea of, I suppose, the federal government using coercive power in order to secure some sort of monopolized access to a capability, the story in the FT overnight Australian time is about some early discussions apparently between OpenAI and US federal government about the company handing over a 5% stake to the federal government or to the nation in some form. Now, look, you tell me what you think about this, but my view for a long time has been that over the long term, at least, the proceeds of the economic benefits of artificial intelligence are going to have to be distributed. And it's made sense to me that giving citizens an equity stake in the capital makes more sense, I suspect, than something like a sort of a stipend payout like universal basic income or something like that. So over the long term, it makes a lot of sense to me, and I'm quite sympathetic to the idea, but it's very, very hard to avoid this impression that this could actually just be a kind of a political buy-off. And that would be immensely depressing, in this moment in 2026. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, as you say, I think there's really two ways of approaching this question of a public equity stake in the AI companies. One of them is a direct government stake where the government owns and controls the stake. The government might have a board seat in that world. They might have voting shares. The other is the one where some portion of the equity is devoted to the public, and then that portion is split into pieces, and every single member of the American public gets a piece. I'm a simpleton, and so I like that second idea much more, because I would prefer to just give people the capital. It's so funny because people like Bernie Sanders talk a big game about being redistributionist, but I guarantee you Bernie Sanders hates the outcome I'm describing, because he doesn't want the American people to get the capital. He wants it, right? He wants the capital so that he can create exquisite schemes of social redistribution. And in that sense, I don't see why, right? Ultimately, the best form of redistribution is you're giving the money directly to the people.
And would they be able to sell that, for instance? I mean, I suppose the risk is that the people who are most financially needy in the moment are going to say, oh, fantastic, I've got, $1,000 worth of OpenAI stock. I'm going to take the $1,000 cash now. And so you actually don't achieve the effect of giving people a long-term stake in what is this transformational technology. But I suppose, I mean, you as a classical liberal, you believe that ultimately those decisions should be made by the individuals. Is that right?
I mean, if people want to sell their stakes, they're more than welcome to do it. I think the people will regret that. Also, by the way, I'm fine with it being in a vehicle where the government applies some sort of it could be that there's a substantial tax penalty for taking it below a certain age or something like that, right? Outside of certain circumstances, right? We have all sorts of tax vehicles, in the United States, in the US tax code, that are designed for circumstances like this. So I think we could probably figure that out if we were worried about everyone selling their equity stakes, which I agree is a potentially realistic outcome. What I would say is this, you are probably right that there's some version of this that could be coded as this is a bribe. And some people will see it that way, but I see it differently. And the reason that I don't love this idea, to be clear, I kind of am of the opinion that I'm a pretty old school classical liberal in the sense that I have a very high degree of confidence that the frontier labs are going to create far more value than they capture, because that's the way every technology has worked, basically. They'll create far more value than they capture. They'll also pay a bunch of money in taxes. Their employees will pay a bunch of money in capital gains taxation and income tax. The company will use its profits to build large amounts of infrastructure, which will benefit, including energy infrastructure, which will benefit the whole, American economy and any other countries that choose to participate in that build out. All that stuff will happen. And the American people will benefit far more than OpenAI. And, this is like the fallacy that the American left very much does not agree with that story, but that is a story that I believe is true, and I believe it's backed up by the overwhelming thrust of the evidence. So I don't think any of this is like necessary in that regard. But where I do think it's necessary basically comes down to Western societies have a problem of institutional legitimacy. And I think a lot of the people do not feel as though they have a real part, a real stake in what is happening in the future. And they don't feel like they're going to be upside participants in it. They feel like the future is something that's happening to them. And I think if you just gave people an equity stake, then it would be abroad. But I think if you gave people an equity stake as a way of saying, hey, we want everyone to participate in this. We want everyone to benefit in all the best, in all the conceivable ways from this. And we want to build a world where the institutional architecture has legitimacy, makes people feel bought in, makes people feel like they have a part to play in the future and an upside stake in it. And I think that if the public equity component given to the broad, thrust of the American people, if that were the message, I think I could be supportive of it.
I think you put that fantastically. I mean, I suppose the Bernie Sanders idea of, you need to give us 50% of OpenAI because, goddamn it, you owe it to us. You owe that back to the American people. And I'm not being partisan here. And in a sense, as a non-American, it's none of my business what the internal politics are. But I would disagree strongly with that idea that it is owed back to the people. But what you are describing, which is, I suppose, almost a more sort of pragmatic way of saying this technology is going to be transformative. And of course, we're going to need to see what the economic impacts are in terms of how it might shift value from labor to capital, for instance. But basically, if we want to bring the population with us as this technology transforms our economy, our society, and our institutions, giving them a share in it is simply, I suppose, a political gesture that would be just enormously and obviously beneficial.
Yeah.
I hope I'm summarizing your view correctly there, but I'm furiously agreeing with you, I think.
I think it's beneficial if it can be paired with like real institutional vision.
Right.
For like what the future looks like. And look, no one has the answers to that. I'm not going to pretend like I do. I am writing a book that attempts to provide some answers, but I'm sure that it won't be complete. There's a lot of work to be done, but I think it's a good starting point.
Yeah. I can't wait for that book to come out. And I want to touch on some of those issues of institutional evolution in a moment, but a couple more just coming back to the safety question. I think what you're sort of broadly describing is the maximum possible sort of equitable distribution of access to the technology while making sure that it's safe. You referred a little while ago to the fact that practically it's very difficult to envisage frontier models being generally commercially available for the foreseeable future if they keep on improving, obviously, in the way that Mythos Preview did. It's just very hard to make the argument that labs could continue to release those without restrictions. I have a question about whether you see a solution to this. So if we decide that widespread deployment is healthier in principle, we then have to ask whether risks can be managed in a way that is scalable in perpetuity. So the quote that I read out of yours before, you said it's the most powerful technology ever conceived. I completely agree with that. Maybe every commercial version of new AI models or applications can have safeguards, a little like, Fable 5 and Mythos 5 are, as I understand it, with my imperfect technical understanding, are essentially Mythos Preview with strict safeguards on them. Then we might compare it to, say, a motor vehicle, which can be dangerous if it's misused, but in reality, happily enough, most people don't grossly misuse it. Now, that seems like a reasonable comparison, except that scale and degree do actually matter. So if you can do X amount of damage by misusing a car, you might be able to do 100X amount of damage with an AI product released in 2027. So, I mean, the scaling does actually matter. Can we perpetually put reliable enough safeguards on increasingly powerful models to contain them to a point where they could be used by you or I or a member of the public such that they're kind of commercially available?
Yeah. So there's a lot of different ways one can approach this question. I think it depends on the concern you're trying to address. So there's a lot of different reasons, in other words, that the frontier might be restricted. It might be restricted because the government says so. And we live in this world right now where the government says so and it doesn't really matter what intellectuals think about it. It's well, Howard Lutnick said you can't release the model. And so therefore you can't. And what does Howard Lutnick know about AI? It doesn't matter. He knows everything. As far as you're concerned, he's a genius about AI. He's the king. And that's the way this works. So that's one reason. There's really not that much you can do about that. Another might be there are safety concerns that we address through technocratic means. And it's some combination of we assess the marginal risk combined with the quality of the safeguards. And that sort of defines the distribution, what kind of distribution you're allowed to have. That seems very plausible. So for example, you could imagine my proposal has always been for there to be basically private auditing bodies that sort of define what good looks like in the context of technical safeguards. And then those private auditing bodies could say, yeah, this is good to be released as far as we're concerned. Now, it might be the case, it's worth noting that even in the presence of those bodies, that not every single capability profile of every model is going to be released publicly. You could imagine, for example, that some really commercially valuable things like in biomedicine, the labs might keep that to themselves and selected partners, right? In the pharmaceutical industry. That's sort of what Google DeepMind already does with its biology foundation models and Isomorphic Labs, which is its subsidiary that is developing drugs in partnership with some pharmaceutical companies. You can imagine things like that.
And
also imagine a world
that's perfectly reasonable from a commercial point of view, right?
Yeah. What I'm saying is there are a lot of completely legitimate commercial reasons that you can imagine certain types of model capabilities not being exposed to the general public. But what I said, toward the beginning of this conversation was that it isn't a matter of is there a gap between the public frontier and the private frontier. There will be a gap because of commercial reasons, because of security reasons, because of regulatory reasons, because of a lot of different things put together. The question is, how wide is that gap? And the frontier is always moving. So both the public and private frontiers are also in constant motion. So what you want to do is keep the gap between these two moving things as minimal as you can. And the way I propose doing that personally is that we have an auditing process for the safety and security procedures of the frontier labs, such that first it would just be auditing them against their own published safety and security plans, which they're required to publish by law in the United States now, by state law in California and New York. And soon enough, I think eventually we'll be able to make either from the government or from a third party like the auditors themselves might be able to publish, their own spec that defines, what good looks like in the context of technical safeguards. And then you get audited against that. And that's, if you pass that audit, then, maybe you're not allowed to do business as a frontier AI developer unless you pass that audit. Or maybe it's softer. Maybe it's you can do business, but there's going to be some carrots we give you that are really, really, really valuable, like favorable treatment under liability, procurement in regulated industries, government procurement, things like this. These things that you'll want, such that practically speaking, most people or everyone gets the certification. I think you can imagine those things all combining in different ways. But that's how I would do it, and have it, I think most importantly, have it all be public. Transparent to the public. The public should know what good looks like. Everyone who works at the companies should know what good looks like. It should be clearly published. That's an important function of the rule of law.
Okay, no, that makes sense. And look, I think the third-party auditors idea is certainly a very valuable contribution to trying to find some middle way between too little regulation in which power concentrates within the labs, and too much regulation where power concentrates in the federal government. So that does, I mean, it's an example of that sort of, I suppose, that creative thinking about how we need to evolve institutions that we will get onto in a moment. I do want to ask you about, I mean, distribution globally now. Here we get into the middle powers discussion that I did want to cover with you, because you've written about it with your sometime collaborator and friend Anton Leicht, who, well, Anton doesn't know it yet, but he will also be on the podcast, I think, in the coming weeks. But
good, he's great.
Yeah, fantastic, really impressive guy. So, I mean, look, I suppose as an Australian, I want the gap that you've talked about between one potential centre of power and everyone else not to grow too wide. I want that to apply internationally as well. I mean, the geopolitical reality, and we have seen hints of this with Mythos Preview, is that I think the incentives for the US in particular to restrict frontier models is going to become greater. I mean, my hunch is that that is probably a trend rather than a hiccup. I mean, you've acknowledged that effectively in the Middle Powers report with Anton that came out in February. I very much commend this report to everyone. It's still relevant. In fact, it was quite prescient on a lot of issues that are now being discussed more widely here in Australia. And we'll put the link in the show notes, of course. But you argued that middle powers should create leverage for themselves by occupying choke points to ensure, among other things, that they can have continued access to frontier AI. The Australian discussion now, it's starting to galvanise around establishing ourselves as a data centre hub, including for training models. It's certainly something that I'm advocating strongly for. We have all sorts of advantages like energy abundance and strategic depth. We're a long way from threats. We have political and regulatory stability. We've abundant renewable energy, as I mentioned. A couple of niggling obstacles like strict copyright laws, which the labs say are deterring them from training here for risk of getting sued. And of course, we want to negotiate the right conditions on foreign investment so that we make sure we do actually have the leverage that we're seeking. So things are moving in the right direction slowly, but perhaps a little bit too slowly. But how emphatically would you say to Australia that this is something we need to move on and move on fast?
I would say it's extremely important. So, what Anton and I were trying to say, the report that you referenced, it was written leading up to the India summit in February. And we were really trying to send a warning to the middle powers. And the warning was something to the effect of, look, at some point, we don't know when, Anton and I, we don't know when, but at some point, the United States government is going to realize what they have on their hands with respect to this thing we call frontier artificial intelligence. And when they do, they are going to seek to control it, and they're going to seek to control other people with it. And we weren't saying this, by the way, as a critique of the Trump administration. Neither Anton nor I were trying to do that. What we were trying to do was say instead that it is a structural incentive of the US government. The Biden administration, to their credit, did realize what they had on their hands and did try to use, I would say they were setting up the regime in the gentlemanly way that the Democratic Party, the centrists of the Democratic Party in America tend to work compared to the Republican Party. They were setting up through things like the diffusion rule, through things like the executive order about building data centers on federal lands, that was setting up the government to offer lease terms to the frontier labs for federal land. I'm sure would have given the administration lots and lots of control. Let's just put it that way. So like the US government, when they understand what they have on their hands, I think they do seek that kind of control. It's just a structural incentive. And so we were trying to send that message and say, look, like, middle powers have a real quandary here, because here's the thing. You can't build your own. That won't work. You can't build your own sovereign frontier AI thing. Like, that's a total pipe dream and it isn't going to work. You can maybe, keep up with fast following Chinese open source models and whatnot. But the problem with that is, number one, like, you're still dependent on the largesse of somebody else. You're also dependent on a strategy that, like, if you ask me, seems both from a national security and an economic perspective, like, it's a little hard to imagine that continuing forever, you know? When these things cost as much money as they currently do to train, the costs are going up there too. It's not like it's just an American thing. It's not like it's just Americans spend more money, but the Chinese are spending plenty of money. And, you know, the model capabilities that China hasn't quite reached the level of capabilities that America has, but at some point they will. And like, will the Chinese government be okay with those models being open source? Like, that seems surprising.
Well, it's classic. Sorry if I can interrupt. It's classic CCP strategy, isn't it? Which is to undercut and sell at a loss to establish a market advantage until you drive everybody else out, or you capture a market share, and then you can do whatever you want with it, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, right. And so, like, you are just like, I think you still have a dependency there. And so, what I would say is secure access to the frontier. And remember, by the way, that we were writing this in the world of 5 months ago, where what we were trying to say is like, the US is sending a delegation, the US government is sending a delegation to India whose primary message is, we want to export our AI to you. And Anton and I were both saying that is not going to be the message forever. I think that looks pretty prescient. I do think that we called that one correctly analytically. But we were trying to say, like, a lot of middle power civil society that I encounter tends to think of the AI inference market as fundamentally a buyer's market. And I think it's a seller's market. And so does Anton. At least for the next 5 years, I think it's probably a seller's market. And what that means is, like, you don't have the leverage. You know, I think countries don't necessarily have the leverage that they think they have. And so, yeah, all that adds up to, I think, really the only smart strategic play is, like, you got to own choke points in the physical world, and that can be data centers. But I think it can also be the production of stuff that matters. That can be critical minerals. It can be things like uranium, processing too, not just mining, but processing. It can be energy. It can be manufacturing the things, like, think about what the future is going to require and then build that stuff, create industrial policy to build that stuff. So it could be robotics. It could be, the magnets that go into nuclear fusion reactors or something, right? There's all sorts of fun bets you can make. But those are the kinds of things I would be doing if I were a middle power.
So there are downstream opportunities, or, you know, nodes that you can occupy as well.
Yes.
I mean, just to again furiously agree with what you've just been saying. Insofar as I specialize at all, I come from a strategic policy background, and for quite a while I've been thinking, if I were the United States, it would be bonkers to say, you know, our companies are creating superpowers and super weapons here. We're just going to share them with anyone who wants them. I don't say that as a whiny thing as a US ally, although, you know, generally speaking, the US has tended to share a lot of its high-end technology with us, and famously in the last few years, nuclear propulsion technology for submarines. But, you know, with no sense of resentment whatsoever, if I were in the US government's shoes, I would be following the same basic incentives on frontier AI. Let me ask you, is there any sense in a country like Australia building, not, or at least putting itself in a position where it has options and agency to build foundational models? So not necessarily frontier, but, you know, something, a sort of foundational general purpose model that can be adapted, that can be fine-tuned to our own needs. It would be good enough, and it could run essential things like national security and critical infrastructure if we really need it. My hunch here, I mean, the reason I bring it up is that I'm very pessimistic about geopolitics. I think it's going to be ugly as hell for probably the rest of the century. And personally, I would rather pay an extra percentage point in my income tax for the sake of my children, so that I know that they will live in a country that has options when it comes to something like a foundational model. Is that just silly, or do you think that there's some rationale to that?
It all depends on the particulars, which is a frustrating answer, but true. When it comes to sort of like, if you're thinking about that in terms of like language models, like generalist agents, I would say the answer is probably no, that you probably shouldn't do that. And the reason I would say that is that if you're talking about things that are like, in particular, if they're like government and national security uses, the best models in the world today are nowhere near good enough for like a lot of those uses, right? They're getting very, very good, but, you know, we're not close to being able to like automate the operations of a nuclear power plant or something, right? And I think the level of reliability that you would want for that is just really quite high. And so I kind of think this good enough concept that I hear a lot for things like that is like probably not the right target to be aiming for. But what I would say can make a lot of sense is, there might be particular kinds of bets that you can make on scientific foundation models, data, right? And that can be, potentially quite valuable. And so that's like kind of the way I would be thinking about it more than I would be thinking about trying to build my own language models. I think that's like unlikely to work, alas.
Okay. So if it's that important that you feel you need your own model as a redundancy, then second best probably just isn't worth having. I mean, if you're talking about national security or something absolutely critical to the survival of your nation, fair enough.
I think that's right.
You also advise middle powers to deploy and adopt AI wisely, including into government, because, and this is a fascinating argument in this middle powers paper, because otherwise government functionality deteriorates relative to other sectors. The information advantage that has always enabled governments to do things that others couldn't do is eroding. It's been eroding for some time, but with advancing AI, that informational advantage could actually collapse. It's a great argument. As I said it before, I commend the paper to everyone, but that section of the paper in particular, I really think that people should read. We're getting into institutions now, and I do share your fascination with the way that institutions will evolve. Let's say the more mundane aspects of the public service, the bureaucracy, are increasingly automated. So things like service delivery, for instance. Then let's say that moves up to higher and higher responsibilities. So, for example, in the Westminster system, at least, the public service, as well as providing services, paying entitlements, all of those sorts of things to the nation, another big part of its role is, of course, to prepare policy options, to be the brains trust to prepare policy options for the elected executive government. Now, that is actually something that I could imagine artificial intelligence doing increasingly well, synthesizing information, for instance, about the economy in order to be able to provide policy options to our cabinet or, our treasurer and therefore to our cabinet. At some point, then people are going to get squeamish and say, well, who is actually running things? To what extent do you think we are actually at some stage going to have to very proactively draw hard red lines around what must necessarily remain human judgment? And to what extent do you think either I'm overblowing that trend or you think it will just sort of work itself out and we'll sort of, navigate our way through it over time?
It's a good question. I think that most things in the world tend to be muddle through problems, frankly. I think we'll probably muddle through most of these issues of institutional transformation. I don't think that precludes the possibility of really cataclysmic shocks that aren't necessarily I wouldn't necessarily characterize that as drawing red lines. I would characterize that as more like events that are unavoidable, but that represent sort of a big unwinding of an institutional order. I think of things like World War I as a good example of, a massive unwinding of the social order or of the institutional order, of old Europe. Maybe what I would add to that is that I do think that AI will kind of mean that a lot of limitations on human conduct are likely to erode in the face of AI. There's going to be a lot of new things. And just biology is a great example. The world of bioengineering will increasingly just be, like software engineering. We can use biology as a tool to produce arbitrary outcomes in nature. And that's the limit. And we won't get there, in the entirety, but it will feel more and more and more like that. We can do almost anything, at least if you have enough time and money to apply to it. And so at some point, if that's true, then you have to impose arbitrary limits, not arbitrary, but artificial limits on your society. You can't just, the fully libertarian approach to like completely arbitrarily modifiable biology does not end well for anybody, you know? And so we will have to be willing to draw hard lines in the sand at certain points and on certain topics. And which ones those are, I think the one good example that we found so far has been on kids. It does seem like there's broad agreement on that. And maybe that's a mistake. Maybe we'll ultimately look back on that as a mistake, but I think we have to kind of, ultimately muddle through and take things issue by issue. We should not try to bite off more than we can chew, which is very, very tempting and easy to do in AI policy.
Right. What about representative democracy as an institution? I mean, you have from what I've read of your work, you have a Burkean conservatism, I suppose, which I, to some degree, share. Basically, top-down radical transformations and revolutions have tended never to work. We should accept when things are working fairly well and shouldn't mess too heavily with them, even if we start to realize that, say, a new artificial intelligence model or an application could do a better job of certain functions. Tell me, how have you started to think about how something like representative democracy could actually evolve in the AI age over the next few decades?
I don't have a great answer to this. I don't want to pretend like I do. I don't know. I mean, I think that like the notion that we're going to a polling place with a piece of paper to vote is like highly technologically contingent. And so you can imagine that it goes in a lot of different directions, but it's just too hard to say.
Okay. On politics, you've said that you don't believe that such a sort of fundamentally human process as politics could be commandeered by even a super intelligent AI. And it's one reason why you reject doomerism, which is this idea that superintelligence will take over and kill us all. I mean, I find your arguments encouraging, but at the same time, I feel like I want there to be zero margin of error here if we're talking about the fate of all living things. But you've talked about how you don't think that politics could be done necessarily infinitely better by a superintelligence. I'm really fascinated by your belief that intelligence doesn't translate sort of one-to-one into power, and that superintelligence is unlikely to take the shape of a kind of unitary entity that can direct everything from a central decision-making point like an omnipotent dictator. It's a really fascinating take. Can you just give us the précis of that?
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think that, like, if you think about the smartest people in history, have they really been the most powerful? Is that like really accurate? That doesn't feel right at all to me.
Well, I think extreme power seeking obviously comes from a combination of character traits as well as some historical contingencies as well. I would say that none of them have been dummies either. I mean, I think it's very difficult to persuade large numbers of people to your cause and to sort of mobilize and to build alliances and coalitions if you're thick. So I think, a sort of reasonably high level of intelligence. And it may be that super intelligent people just they're not particularly interested in that kind of power seeking. But it's a combination of personality traits. But sorry, I've interrupted.
No. I guess what I would say is, like, yes, it requires a certain kind of intelligence that involves like persuading people of stuff. And it's not that AIs can't be persuasive. I think they absolutely can be persuasive, but it isn't an intrinsic capability of the actor. The person you are persuading has to be persuaded. And so the messenger does matter. Like, there are things that the messenger can't change about themselves that affect the way the people they're trying to persuade hear their message. And I think this will apply, like AI as a social actor, its communications will be tied to specific context, a specific register. People will hear it in a certain way. So if you need to convince people, again, it's not that AI won't be able to persuade people at all, but it just feels very different to me from like what we think of as human persuasion. It's not obviously the kind of characteristic that benefits, like, I don't know if you would really call intelligence as being the thing there that gives humans that persuasive capability. And it's not really obvious to me how that intersects with the social role that AI will play at all. So when people talk about like an AI that can do politics better than humans can, that is kind of assuming a world in which humans and political institutions have totally accepted AIs that do politics, which to me implies basically machine takeover, like already.
Yeah.
Like it sort of assumes the conclusion. And so it's very easy once it's subtle and people don't realize that they're doing it. And I know people don't realize that they're doing it because when I tweeted about this, a lot of people did not understand the point I was making. The world is more complicated than people are giving it credit for. Mm-hmm. And AI doing politics assumes that AI has taken over political institutions. Like if AIs have control over the military, right? Because AIs have taken control of political institutions, then yeah, like at that point, the AIs have taken over the world. It's like, yeah, you've assumed the conclusion.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Conscious of time, let me finish off with one last question here. Let's end happy. You're a techno-optimist. I'm an aspiring techno-optimist, and I desperately want things to work out well. Give me a quick burst here. Can this be the best thing that ever happens to us as a species? And can you quantify your degree of confidence that we'll get there?
My degree of confidence that we will end up in a place where humans are better off in basically all ways that are measurable and that matter. I think I feel quite confident that that will happen. I feel like my P-doom is quite low. P-doom is different from P-dystopian outcome or like P-otherwise bad outcome. And I do think that is like more possible. But overall, I feel 75, 80% chance that we're going to end up in a very good place, maybe even higher than that. I mean, to be clear, there could be a lot of turbulence in the meantime.
I have no doubt we're going through a real period of upheaval. Do you have an idea of what you would like it to shake out as? I mean, I'm picturing a world in which, I suppose, protected individual freedoms and choices are very strong and broad. It doesn't turn out that without necessary labor to, feed and clothe ourselves, we all seek superficial entertainment with drugs and pornography or whatever, that we actually are able to adapt to a world in which, sort of necessary work is done for us and it frees us up to do things that enrich us and expand us, and that we can do this as individuals and still function together collectively. I mean, I sort of have a reasonably good idea of what I would like a quote unquote utopia to look like that could emerge from this. I mean, do you have a sort of clear idea of what you want?
Well, I mean, I want humans to have longer lifespans and a great deal of health. I want diseases to be cured. I want humans to multiply faster than we currently do. In other words, a very high fertility rate. I want us to be able to travel around the world and the solar system at great speed, be able to explore all sorts of things, discover things about the nature of our universe, create all sorts of art. I kind of want the human experience, but only more so, right? Human civilization, but only more so. I think there's a lot of wonderful things that we have the potential to create along the way. I think in terms of like what we do, what our purpose is, I'm fundamentally an optimist in the sense that I think that the things we are automating with AI will be seen in retrospect as a fairly small part of what it is that minds are capable of doing, and that we will co-evolve with the AIs and that we'll build an extraordinary world together.
Good optimistic way to finish. All right. Look, Dean Ball, thank you so much for joining us. It's a conversation I've been really excited about having. So really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated it, and I hope to visit sometime soon. It's a country that's at the top of my bucket list to visit.
You'd love it. I enjoy what I hope will be a restful weekend before you start on Monday.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening, folks. We will be back with another episode soon.